It's story time, and I'm going to tell you a story, a great story of a people who crossed a vast expanse, a mysterious sea into the unknown, and colonized new lands and found new people and melded cultures, and then other new cultures came and warred against them and enslaved them and erased their history and intrigue that leads to entire continents being named and people getting very wealthy and very famous. So, some of the characters in this are a great Mandinka or Mandingo king, a Mali emperor, Italian cartographer who has 2 continents named after him, and an explorer, Christopher Columbus, who claimed to discover these new lands which were already discovered, and he played off multiple crowns to benefit his own treasury. But every story must start with a beginning, and every storyteller must, too, practice his trade before he becomes good at it. This story begins where all stories begin, at the beginning. And the beginning of this story is a young man who, newly christened, finds himself under attack by the earthly powers. The head of a church built upon a pebble that was adversarial to Jesus. And when the head of this evil cult 2,000 years later stumbled across the newly christened young man, its first impulse was, destroy, I must destroy him. And the young man not knowing what he was in for, soon found himself in a crushing battle for his life, where death seemed a certainty under the weight of 1,000 worlds commanded by this cult leader. Yet the young man, like a lamb to the slaughter, was not afraid, and the powerful emperor found his murderous intent rebounded upon him and found himself crushed by his own weight in the presence of the young christened one. And there was an implosion of amassed wealth as a seal was unlocked and that wealth was unleashed against all perceived trends of gravitation and attraction. And out of this meeting, of which only one survived, comes our story. And the lamb was pulled through the slaughter and survived by the grace of the great galactic lion, who we will refer to as that. And guidance began, and the lamb and the lion were united as one. And the lamb, unknowing of what precisely was going on, everything was new and fascinating and glorious and majestic. And the following day, for the confrontation happened in the dead of night, the following day, the great galactic lion introduced a woman to the man, a great woman of times past who was a singer, an inspired and courageous singer who changed the world in her own way, yet was subsumed by a dark cult of Illuminati. They label themselves the inverse of what they are. They walk on tiles of black and white, and though they exist in the darkness, they shine the light on each other and illuminate each other as if they are the stars of this world, when truly they are the bearers of evil. And these evil ones conquered this great woman, but not before she had many a song to sing and to inspire the world. And one of these songs was about Mandinka. And now I will sing it for you and embarrass myself greatly. But I do know Mandinka. And then it goes on, I don't know no shame, I feel no pain, I do feel the flame, but I am no singer. So I bring only embarrassment unto myself, my cheeks flush. But having been led to such a great woman, and years later having circled back on such greatness, the man questions, who is this Mandinga? There must be someone to know. So the search begun for the Mandinga. The Mandinga, who is the Mandinga? And after much searching and discovering, was found the Mandinga kings of Mali. Mali, the great and most wealthy empire of the Western African Horn region, which was rich in gold and peoples and history. A land which was protected from many threats of other civilizations and had a unique cultural arc, and connected at one time through great Ethiopia across Africa and Egypt, and trade from the Phoenicians and Egyptians throughout the Mediterranean and beyond to the English Isles that were not English at the time, but Pictish and Celtic and other more native peoples. And too did they trade down the western coasts of Africa and up the western coasts of Europe, even trading or connecting with the Great Danes and Nords, who had their own explorations and histories of the Atlantic unknown. And our story takes place in the 14th century, the early 14th century, 1310 roughly, when a great Mandinga king known as Abubakari II, his original name Mandebori, the There's other historical things I can't add to the story. But if I was good, like a griot, or a other word for other storytellers who tell of history through story, I would know more details. But I, alas, am just new at my trade. This is my first story. I've had other stories, but this is the first along this line of practice as a practitioner of a historical storyteller. Anyways, the great Abubakari, he heard all sorts of stories of the land beyond the sea, and he was driven by a desire to explore the unknown. As an explorer, had already consolidated his empire and his reign, but land was the empire of the land, and unknown and endless curiosity and untold mysteries lay beyond the sea. And there were stories through oral tales of their griots at the time. I think that's how you call it. I'm not exactly sure, but written stories and oral stories of travels across the sea from the Africans, and perhaps from their connection with the Nords as well, who were also exploring in a similar time period, but perhaps just a little later. It's hard to say. So this Mandinga king, Abubakari II, he used his power and his wealth and collected all of the scholars and the shipbuilders and the navigators and all of the tradesmen, the seamen that he could find and hire with his money, and he equipped a fleet of 200, maybe 400 ships to go and sail into the unknown upon an ocean current that was well known at the time, that was like a river in the sea that would take them right off of the coast from the east to the west into the unknown. And he gathered his fleets, and he manned them with people, and he manned them with supplies, and they were sent off with sails and with oars to the west, to the unknown. And he waited for news of what came of the journey of the expedition. And he waited, and there was no news, and he was getting very impatient of this lack of news. Until at last a ship returned, and the ship said, the fleet entered into a river in the sea, and it was taken out of sight, and I became afraid, and I turned back, and that's why I'm here now. And so Abubakari, the Mandinga king, emperor, he was upset. But his drive to explore was not squandered. It was still strong, but he was not going to sit on the shore and wait. He wanted to explore on his own. And so in the next 2 years, or 1 or 2 years, he redoubled his efforts. He made a fleet of 2,000 ships, a fleet never before seen in the Atlantic Ocean. 1,000 ships for his men and women, and 1,000 ships just for water and supplies and gold and other material supplies. And they created the greatest ships from all of the ability to make ships, and he bought all the ships he could buy and got all the seafarers he could hire, and sent text messages to all of his known compatriots saying, "Come hither and gather all the fleets and the scholars and all the magicians and everyone. We're going to sea." And so he gathered 4,000 ships this time, 2,000 full of his men and his women, and then another 2,000 for the water and the supplies and the gold and the other things, weapons and spearheads. Gold and copper, silver spearheads. And they sailed west into the unknown, and what happened to them in the year 1311, 1312, in the age of the Dominion, the Romans, since the Romans started the calendar. And now the story picks up with Christopher Columbus, sailing with 3 ships, his pathetic little fleet of 3. But his ships are much better. They're caravels, and they can move their masts. The Africans, they had masts and sails, but they couldn't pivot them and tack against the wind. They were at the whim of the wind, and the current that flows across the sea there just goes from east to west. It goes right up the northeast coast of South Africa, right into the southern Caribbean, right along the northern coast, and right along all those Caribbean islands, and then loops up around to Florida, none of which was called that at the time. And when Christopher Columbus sailed to India, the Indies, and, let me backpedal. The Portuguese. He first went to the Portuguese to pay for his travels, but they were not interested in his proposals. He was a very greedy man, and he demanded more than half of all the spoils, even though he wasn't even funding the expedition. And the Portuguese king, Don Juan, said, "No way. No way." And the Portuguese dominated the West African trade, and they had forts and ports, and they intermingled with the Malian people, Mali people. And so they picked up on this knowledge of these fleets that had left, and they had seen them gathering and the evidence of them, and they had heard of the land to the west, which is now known as Brazil. But they didn't really go explore it too much. Or Columbus was down in the Portuguese forts, and he learned these things, and so he was aware of this land to the west. But he couldn't get hired by the Portuguese, so he went to the great Isabel and Ferdinand the Great and Wise, who expelled the child mutilators from their land. They are evil people, those Muslims and Jews who do all these evil things. They expelled them, and they had a great reign of greatness in Spain. And of their greatness and their wisdom, they saw Christopher Columbus, and Isabella especially liked him, and they said, "Yes, we're rich, and we will agree to your terms." And Columbus drove a hard bargain, and he actually got over 50% of the spoils. He demanded 1/3, and then 1/8, and 1/10, and something, 3 different fractions that add up to more than 50% of all of the spoils of whatever they would find in the new lands. And though he had heard of the lands to the south, he had to take a different route because the Portuguese controlled those waters, so he took a more northerly route west to India. And finally he reached land around Cuba, and he learned from the natives that they were black men, traders, Negroes, who came from the southeast. And they found, maybe it was on the second expedition where they found the spearheads. But basically Columbus then also interrogated the locals, and he realized that Cuba was an island. And other things, and he heard of all these tales of gold, for the black people have all the gold, and there's a wealthy golden place. And that was his main mission from the Spaniards. They said, "Find the land, find the gold. Everything is about gold. We must have more of it, more gold, wherever it can be found. Let's get the gold. The gold fever. Find the gold." So Columbus returned after leaving some men behind and having raped and kidnapped many a women and other people. he brought them back to heading back to Spain, but he got shipwrecked in Portugal on his way back, and he's delivered into the hands of the Portuguese king, who now is very regretful that he didn't hire Columbus in the first place, and he's thinking maybe I should just kill him and steal what he has, but the knowledge could not be stolen, and he was driven by the knowledge. And then he conferred with Columbus before Columbus got back to Ferdinand and Isabella, his sovereigns. And Columbus knew of this land, of this continental land of Brazil, and he came up with this idea, or maybe Don Juan knew about it and came up with the idea of splitting the new world with a vertical line where everything to the east of the line would be Portuguese, and the Spanish could have everything to the west of the line. And since they're both Catholic kingdoms, it would be overseen by the Catholic Church, who was the ultimate sovereign above the kings who ruled over all the crowns, dating all the way back to that little pebble, Satan. Simon, the first patriarch that is supposed to be fully honored in the Catholic Church, but who Jesus called Satan, who betrayed Jesus ultimately, but we won't include that in the book. Anyways, Columbus and Don Juan conspired to create this line, and no one else knew about this land to the east of the line, so the Spanish didn't know what they were giving up because they didn't know anything about it. But Don Juan and Columbus both knew from the Malians. I don't know if that's how you call them, the Mandingas. This great land. And Columbus pretended that Cuba was the main land, even though he knew it was an island. And then he pretended that Brazil was an island, even though he knew that was a continent, because he wanted to drive a separate agreement with the Portuguese crown, where he would get probably more than half of the spoils of that one. And therefore, both crowns competing to gain the wealth on both sides of the line would both benefit Columbus, and he would get more than half of the spoils from each because he was so smart and double-dealing. And in the background, he was dealing with Amerigo Vespucci. He was his agent, and that's who he was using as a back agent to deal with the other crowns. And somehow, because of the conspiracy between Columbus and Vespucci, the continent got called America, even though in the beginning it was only South America that was called America. Somehow it all became America, all named after the agent of Columbus, Vespucci. Amerigo. So all of your heritage is all linked to a conspiracy of a kidnapping, rapist, double-dealing, treacherous person, Columbus, who was working with his agent, the cartographer, to double deal and trick both crowns and make sure that they benefited, not the crowns, but Columbus, and he hired Vespucci. And there's a lot of more complexity to the plot, and I'm only just discovering it. But on we go to the second voyage. In the second voyage, Columbus is sent out to colonize the land and set up a fort and colony of people and figure out where the gold is. Whenever you can, find the gold. And so on the second voyage, I believe, he finds people on Hispaniola, Haiti, or now Dominican Republic, Haiti, who the Catholic Church hates more than anyone else. And before the great hurricane, or the great earthquake in Haiti, the Pope was like, they are the cursed people who rebelled against our reign, and the Emperor will use the Death Star and destroy them in the most epic hurricane ever. And then we will use the Bushes and the Clintons to sell everyone this Red Cross thing, and if you only text this number and send $10, surely the Haiti people will get it, when in fact we will steal all the money from the naive people, and then we will bring in Israeli military hospitals to come in and harvest the organs of all of the orphans, or whoever we could find to harvest organs for, the good blood donors, and the Clinton Foundation will get caught with many dozens of children that they're smuggling out into their human child trafficking networks. Yes. So they really don't like Haiti, and they don't like blacks or Africans at all. If Because, let me tell you the main incentive, that if the lands were already discovered, the natives don't count, of course, but if the Negroes came from the old world and had already colonized and discovered the lands, then Columbus was out of a lot of money, so there's a big money incentive to deny the existence of the Mandingas that came before. And in Haiti, they come across these spearheads. They're more than half gold, and then they're copper and silver, and they're forged to these spearheads, which were only seen in the Mali kingdoms, which Columbus recognized. And then they saw Africans in different places. At one point, a different person is crossing the isthmus of the Panama Canal, where they had set up a fort in the Darien Gap, and they seized power, and then they crashed through the jungles to the western shore of the Pacific, and they found the Pacific. And no sooner did they find the Pacific than they found black men who were captive by the local tribes. And the black men had come over the Andes, and they were warring with them. And also they had found black men on all these other islands and in different places. And probably all around Suriname and Guyana was another place where the blacks had been and colonized, and probably right around Colombia too, which Columbus never went to, but it's still named after him because it bears his heritage of conquest and kidnapping and raping and lying and treachery. And there's lots of evidence of the black man throughout South America and the Caribbean and Florida, and maybe even into some of these mound type architecture things in the southeast that were heavily secreted, and that Jefferson sent Lewis and Clark to explore, amongst other things. And systematically the history of the blacks were eliminated, and their wealth was stolen, and then they were enslaved, and you don't know about it other than this story, which is so good that I tell you. And what else is in the story? Well, probably the history. Oh, well, if you gotta go back further, you gotta go way further, to like 700 BC, so like almost a millennium and a half earlier. And you've got all sorts of statues of black people and the Olmecs. Basically, probably some Phoenicians sailing around from Egypt, or maybe hired by Egypt. I'm still confused by the connection between Phoenicians and Egypt, because it's like they are connected, but they're like separate, sort of. I think the Phoenicians are like the traders, the sea-based traders that the Egyptians would rely on, but they're not strictly Egyptian. And anyways, there's history of like these Olmec statues of black and African people having been in America all the way back to like 700 BC or something. But anyways, so the main voyage happens in like 1310, 1311. And then, what do you know, the Aztecs start building pyramids like within a decade after that. And they have they have basically like priest type people. So like the Africans, so they bring superior knowledge and stuff, and mathematics and history of architecture and all sorts of stonework and all sorts of stuff to the natives who didn't have all this. And then so they start building these pyramids, and then the black people are kind of like at the top of the pyramid of the social hierarchy and kind of like revered as gods because they take control. And then when the white people come in, they just have to like kill the black people, and then they're at the top of the pyramid. And it doesn't make all that much difference for the natives, essentially, except that it seems like the Africans kind of like worked with them in a symbiotic way, whereas the white men kind of just like were much more just about all the gold. Because the African people, they were already wealthy in gold, so they weren't afflicted by the gold fever. They were afflicted by the exploration fever. So they explore, and then they do war with some of the tribes, and they take over other tribes, and the Aztec cultures, and the pyramid building is all like directly following the migration of the Africans over. And yeah, that's kind of the fruition of the story. I gotta go. Well, anyways, so this whole story, I'm on a whole sequence of storytelling, and next I'm gonna get into the Masons and Washington and how they hijacked the revolution against the crown and captured it for the Jews who are behind the Masons and who are also behind the English crown. And the Jews hate the Africans a whole lot, and probably because the Africans beat them to America, or maybe there's some other reason. I don't really fully understand that kind of like historical animosity, but the Jews actually hate a lot of different. They hate everyone that's not them, essentially, except for the Mormons. They like the Mormons because the Mormons, like from the beginning, are just kind of like subservient to them or something, and then they get all connected with the Masons. But anyways, that's a whole another story. So I had to start with this story because I was going to start with Washington, but I've actually got to start with Columbus because Columbus becomes before Washington, but he's planting a lot of the seeds that Washington grows out of, in a way, as far as like cultural seeds and warmongering and imperialism, and most of that from Washington really comes from the English, but the whole aspect of Columbus being like Columbus Day and being this like revered person is important to start these stories here. And so the missing piece of this story, there's some sort of missing puzzle piece to conclude the story that I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it has to do with like the University Columbia. Is that the first university in the U.S.? I don't really know, but the story is kind of fading off into the unknown now, which is not a good way for a story to end. But like I said, it's my first one. So now you know about the Mandinka king and how he colonized, or he didn't really colonize because the indigenous were already there, but he first kind of in this millennia, really, and then the Nords traveled to like North America within like a couple decades after that, so they probably were also driven by this one Mandinga king, Mandingbori or Abubakari II, who changed the world. He was probably the most influential person changing the world, and Columbus was largely was in many ways reactionary to what he had done. Not entirely, but largely, because Columbus got a lot of his information about the New World when he was down in like Mali or the Portuguese forts on the African coast, and yeah, that's the end of the story. But it seems that there's some kind of here's how we'll end it. What's that movie with the hidden African culture? They made it into like a Marvel thing of the Panther people king of whatever that thing was called. It was a big movie. You'll know. I'm blanking on it. You'll know. But it's not in Africa. It's actually in the Brazilian rainforest and hidden. They had to, as the white man was coming and they realized they couldn't fight the power coming from Europe and their superior sails and gunpowder like a couple hundred years later, it drove them inland. And so they went up the Amazon River and they went inland and up into Venezuela, and the white men tracked them down for the most part, so they had to use the geography to hide from the white man, and some of it might have persisted, and it might be hidden, a whole hidden lineage. But they were persecuted by the Catholics and other white people with gold fever. And, slavery. So a lot of the slaves, they say all the slaves were taken in Africa and then brought to the New World. But actually a lot of them had gotten to the New World in early 14th century, and basically like 9 or 10 generations had passed for them to kind of like reproduce and also somewhat interbreed with the natives. And so a lot of the slaves that they took were already in the New World, but they had to cover that up. And so they just say that they brought all the slaves over, and they did bring a lot of slaves over. But and they also conquered the Mali kingdom after that, and then they took a lot of slaves from that kingdom to the New World. So they ultimately got like double screwed, because both the old kingdom they left behind and the new kingdom, or the new kind of culture that they created in the New World, mostly got captured. But still, that one man and his ambition to explore to the west changed the world forever. And Columbus kind of did in a way too, but one was more for the better, and then the other one was more imperial, and then kind of like erased the first one. But it's important to know the history and there's many different data points. I didn't even get to all of them. But anyways, I read this book, so I had done all sorts of research, and now I've actually found a book of another guy who did even more research, and so I'm reading it now. They came before Columbus, and by a guy named Ivan. You'd think he's a black guy, but with a name like Ivan Van Sertima, he sounds more kind of like Norwegian or German, or I don't even know. But anyways, that's the end of our story. We've touched on Columbus and kind of the morality behind Columbus, and my next big story, I'm going to talk about Washington and how he betrayed the revolution and usurped the original continental kind of, was it a confederation or something? The original confederation of states, and he was behind the federalization of everything, and how he was opposed to Stark, the Great Stark, that the theme of the Stark. Anyways, that's the end of the story, so I'll give you another story another time, and I just wanted to tell the story.